All right, then moving on, we're now in part 14 on corruptions of Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses. If you'd like to follow along, you can go to creationliberty.com, go to, well, basically just type in the word witness, WITNESS, in the little search bar that's on the website there, and that'll get you to that article. Or if you're listening by YouTube, there should be a link in the description, and that should take you roughly to where we are. Now, it's interesting because I was going to make mention of this, the videos that I have on YouTube, like I take off the comments and the voting, like rating stuff and all that kind of thing. Now I can see that stuff, like somewhat some of the numbers and all that just pop up on the screen, and it's interesting that people are downvoting on the videos where I'm exposing the child sex abuse. I don't know if they're hitting the thumbs down button because it's just, because I have people that follow and they do that all the time. Like they just thumbs down on anything I've got because they'll, that's one of the reasons I knocked that out anyways, because what we had originally was a problem where there was a bunch of atheists that would subscribe to our channel, and they were only doing it so they could open up the video, press the dislike button, and then close it. Like they weren't even watching it. I checked out the analytics and some of that stuff, and they weren't even watching it. So I was like, what's the point of having ratings? The truth is not based on majority opinion anyway. And we get more positive than negative. I mean, that's, for the most part, we usually do. But I said, you know what? It doesn't matter. If we could have 100% positive rating, it still wouldn't matter. We can have 100% negative rating, it still wouldn't matter. And the comments are pretty much useless because YouTube is no place for an actual conversation. So I thought, you know what, I'll just point them to the forum. That's what I do. On the description, there's a link to the forum where people can go and you can comment on any of the videos on there and have discussions with us on it if you want. And the ratings are useless, but I can still see them. And the thing is, when I watch people downvote, I was like, I hope they're just downvoting because they're upset about the... people are listening and doing that. They're just upset about the child sex abuse that's going on in Jehovah's Witnesses. Because what it makes it look like is that you're downvoting it like you're pro-pedophile. Like, that doesn't make any sense, okay? It just, looks really bad if somebody's downvoting that. Why would you downvote exposing and trying the pedophiles and trying to protect children? That doesn't make any sense to me. But, people do ridiculous things a lot of times, and it just I never know why. I mean, we never get really reasons for that. But last week, what we ended talking about was this BCB and BCG. Now, those were two abbreviations or just letters that were given to a name to hide the person's name because they didn't want to come out, and that's to protect their privacy, and that's totally understandable. This was a big case, internationally known. They don't want their names out there. They don't want to be harassed, and they have a right to not be harassed by the media. There's no reason for that, especially with the very sensitive material that's coming out in this case. So we were talking about that last week, about them saying, well, I think we reference them to the police if there's something wrong, like there's some crime that's been committed. I think we have them go to the police. No, nobody ever said it, and that was the point. So we covered BCB just a little bit, but now let's go to the other victim. And this is the Australian trial that we were referring to before in previous teachings. And this is BCG, okay? Now, BCG was sexually abused by her father, and the Jehovah's Witness elders knew about it. They not only, it wasn't just that they knew about the sexual abuse of BCG, but also the sexual abuse of his other 3 daughters. The man had 4 daughters. He sexually abused all of them. This is, again, from the Australian Associated Press, from an article called Jehovah's Witnesses Did Not Report 1,000 Child Abusers, Inquiry Hears, from The Guardian, which says, quote, Stewart said BCG would tell the commission her father had also abused her older sister and 2 younger sisters, but the 3 elders who heard her case did not take these offenses into account. Why not? We have no idea. Outside of what they're going to say, well, each crime was a different crime, and there wasn't a secondary eyewitness to any of them, so we'll just, put it in a file and forget about it. I know it sounds absurd, but that is exactly what they did. I mean, Nothing about that's biblical. They could try to say, oh, we're handling things in a biblical way. No, you are not. We've already demonstrated that. You're way off Bible on this one, and they're doing it to protect themselves. That's what the whole thing is about. They want to save face so they don't look bad in the public, because their outward appearance is all they care about. They are hypocrites who are vile, because they should first clean out the inside of the cup and platter, that the outside would be clean also. It continues to say, BCG's father was ultimately disfellowshipped not for his sexual abuse, but for lying. Like I said, I'm not creative enough to make this stuff up. And haven't we seen this pattern already? Haven't I showed you? Wasn't the other guy, you remember the other guy I was talking about? They disfellowshipped him for having a belligerent attitude, but not for sex abuse against a young lady. He continues and says her father immediately appealed the decision to cast him out of the Jehovah's Witness community at Mariba in far north Queensland. At the church's appeal hearing, he admitted to the abuse, and his excommunication was upheld, but a few years later, he was reinstated, end quote. So basically what we have is multiple eyewitnesses that are coming forward and saying, look, this man did this to me. And they happen to be all four of his daughters. Now, somebody could say, well, all four of his daughters could have gotten together and lied. That I'm not saying couldn't happen, but I would highly, highly doubt that's happened in the history of the world. Okay? That four of a man's daughters would all come against him in some plot to conspiracy to, manipulate their dad or to cause him to go to prison or something like that just because they're hateful. Like, I could imagine one, maybe even a couple of the daughters doing that, but not all four of them. That just doesn't make sense. And all of them being obedient to the Jehovah's Witness, community, which you have to be a part of Jehovah's Witnesses, that doesn't make any sense either. All four of their testimonies should have been brought into consideration when dealing with this guy. And he might confess it and all that, and he was excommunicated from them, but what about contacting the police? What about the protection of these girls? Well, they don't really care about that protection, and I will show you that. I'll demonstrate that to you shortly, towards the end of this part of the teaching. So, anyway, you might as well throw out the two witness rule in that one, really, because there are technically four eyewitnesses, but they did not care. It's not just this one, folks. There are many other instances I've read in the Jehovah's Witnesses about sexual abuse coming forward against the same man. Multiple women are saying, look, or not just women, multiple women and girls, little girls are coming forward and saying the same thing about the same man. Some of them are not connected to one another, and yet he's protected by the Jehovah's Witness elders. In this specific situation, there were four eyewitnesses. All those eyewitnesses were the same victims, yet the Jehovah's Witness elders sheltered the child abuser and only temporarily kicked him out for lying about it, because he was reinstated a few years later. And folks, keep in mind, if he was in prison, how could he be reinstated? He wasn't in prison. They didn't take that anywhere. And they put him back in. I can't. It's not like I want to. I know it sounds like I'm repeating myself. I think it's just because I cannot. It's so absurd, I can't even hardly put it in my head and process that. So continuing with the interview, another quotation with the interview with Jeffrey Jackson, who we've mentioned multiple times. He was the one at the beginning of the child abuse section we did a couple parts ago in this teaching. When I started that, I was quoting from him, in this Australian Royal Commission that he was being interviewed. The man, Stewart, who was interviewing him, Stewart said, quote, well, just on that point, Mr. Jackson, has the governing body considered apologizing to the survivors of child sex abuse at the hands of elders within the organization? Jackson responds, I haven't been in discussion in regard to that. What a political answer. That's politician right there. He's got it written all over him. I mean, why didn't he say instead, I haven't been in the discussions in regard to that, but I certainly hope they do? Why couldn't he say that? Oh, because then him saying, I hope that they do, is getting a reflection that is apart from the actual intention of the Watchtower Society. He'd be kicked out for saying something like that, or he'd have to retract that in some way. So they stay as far away from giving any definitive answers or concern for children at all. I mean, none. So Stewart asks, is that something that you foresee might happen? In other words, that an apology, at least be considered? Jackson responds, the governing body has apologized on other matters. Nobody is asking about other matters. Nobody cares about other matters in this context. We are asking, are you going to apologize to the victims for not taking responsibility to do what was right on these matters? He says, the governing body has apologized on other matters. For me to say, and he pauses, he says, I can't speak collectively for everybody, but we have apologized on things in the past in other areas. It is perceivable. End quote. Politicians galore. And yet, it's never happened. I mean, the ruling of the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have to stop and consider, their ruling is considered the same as Jehovah's ruling. Which means, if they apologize for what they do, then they have to confess that Jehovah was wrong. See, this is no different than okay, you remember when we covered Mormonism, if you go back to our Mormon teaching, and I covered the Quorum of the 12 Apostles? Yeah, they operate the exact same way. It's amazing that Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons just, fire shots at each other, but they operate the exact same way. For example, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, when we went over that, it's back when remember what the Mormons teach, that if, God is having sex with like infinite amounts of wives, and they're all giving birth to spirit babies, and that's where spirits are born, and then they go to earth, and if they're a good spirit baby, they get a white skin body, and if they're a bad spirit baby, they get a black skin body. That is exactly what they teach. Go back to our Mormon teaching. You can get that by going to creationliberty.com, typing in the word Mormon, M-O-R-M-O-N, into the search bar there at the top right. That will get you to that article, which is called Corruptions of Christianity, Mormonism. And you can read that. What I just said is exactly what they teach. Don't misunderstand and think that I'm making that up somewhere. That's what they teach, and that's what they've always taught. But, so since the inception of Mormons, they didn't allow blacks into Mormonism because they said, well, blacks are bad spirit babies. They can't be saved. They can't be good. They're just genetically disposed to do evil. And that is exactly what Jehovah's Witnesses, like Charles Russell, taught too, is that they're genetically, it's almost like they have to do evil because that's the way they are because of their black skin. It's like all these cults keep teaching the exact same thing. And it's unbiblical in every sense. So, anyway, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, what did they do? Because now, today, you'll see, they have blacks among their ranks. Well, how did that happen? Well, you see, previously, it was basically around the 1970s, okay? So a lot of these protests are going on. You've got the whole Martin Luther King Jr. movement, which that guy was not a Christian. He was a communist. The entire civil rights movement was a communist movement. If you don't understand that and how wicked that all that really was, go to creationliberty.com, type in Martin, M-A-R-T-I-N. You'll find an article called Wolves in Costume, Martin Luther King Jr. The man was not of Christ. People would try to claim that he was some sort of Christian. He had nothing to do with Christ. He did not believe in Christ's doctrine, and he pretty much said so in a lot of his statements. You need to go and check that out and get the quotations and look at what he's saying and doing. The guy was as wicked as he could possibly be. So the point being is that all of this political stuff was going on where the government's starting to change a lot of their policies, and there's a lot of pressure by the public because of all these protests that are going on, which the media help to propagate all this stuff. And because of the pressure that's being put on religious organizations because, we need to have all this affirmative action stuff, what they did is, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, they believe that they are the equivalent of God. basically. It's like God on earth. So the Catholics have that. They have the Pope. The Jehovah's Witnesses have that. They have the elders of the Watchtower. And the Mormons have that. They have the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. That, to them, to these organizations, that is God, right? It's sick, and it's false, and it's wicked, but that's what they believe. So what they did is they got together, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and they made an announcement. And they said, oh, we have prayed. And we got a revelation, folks. We got a revelation. Here it is. Blacks can now be a part of Mormons. I'm just laughing because they do this all the time. Whenever you see a strange decision that is made that is just out of nowhere, like it's totally apart from everything a religious institution has always taught, and they suddenly make a 180 turn and change it around, I'm telling you, and people all the time, they see this stuff. When we get to Catholicism, I'll show you some of these examples, but folks, all the time I see people, they'll say, wow, they just made this decision and nobody can figure out why. If you can't figure out why, follow the political movements of the day. That's the first place I would tell you to look. Follow the political movements. Why? Because the pressure on them to follow whatever political agenda is of the day is based on, okay, we need to keep our numbers up so we can keep our profits high. The love of money being the root of all evil. That's why the Bible's saying that. Yeah, they want, a bunch of numbers, but they want the numbers because they want the money. All right, and they know they're going to lose profits if they hang on to their doctrine, which they say is from God. So what they do is say, well, let's just pray and let's just say, okay, we got a revelation from God, and then we'll tell these people that, and they'll believe us. And they do. That's exactly what happens. So that kind of thing, and I'm just saying all that to give an example that the Jehovah's Witnesses, I mean, if you don't believe me, it's okay. Go ask an ex-Jehovah's Witness who's been a part of it. They will tell you that the Watchtower, like the highest elders in the Watchtower, they, for all intents and purposes, are God to them. You do not question. You question them, you get kicked out. It's a cult. The point is that apologizing to victims would have to say, well, that's like God apologizing. And God apologizing would be God doing something wrong. God does not do wrong. Period. God is He is goodness. All good is of Him. There is no wrong that He does. He's incapable of doing wrong. So they can't apologize because them apologizing would be like God apologizing. You see the problem here. So in addition to that, apologizing to the victims would have to acknowledge that the crimes were committed in the first place, which they don't want to acknowledge that either. And then on top of that, it would make the Watchtower liable for damages due to negligence. So with all those factors considered, they're going to admit nothing. And that's why they don't. There are so many incidents of child sex abuse among Jehovah's Witnesses since its inception. There are a lot. And it's going to be impossible for me to cover them all. Okay, that's not my job either. I'm just going to give a few examples, show you what it is, just to prove the point. And just, well, you can, if you want to do all that research, you can do all that research. Okay, but our website is not, okay, I'm going to log every instance of a crime of any religion that's done. I'm simply using a number of examples to help show a larger point. So that way we're not sitting here thinking that we have to go through 1,000 examples before we can prove that there's a problem going on here. So, in another example, back in 2002, there's a famous reporter named Connie Chung. I remember seeing her on the news when, like my grandmother would watch a news report or something. I remember seeing Connie Chung on there. And she interviewed 2 victims back in 2002. Their names were Amber Long and Heidi Meyer. And sitting with them was the man William Bowen. You remember we mentioned him earlier. He gave us the number of the 23,720 on that list of sex offenders, and he was the founder of SilentLambs.org. He was working with these 2 young ladies. And in this interview from CNN.com, which is entitled Abducted Infant Returned Safely to Parents, Jehovah's Witnesses Caught in Church Scandal. So that was a whole different thing. Let me get to the focus of what we're talking about here. Chung says, quote, joining us from Minneapolis to tell their stories in the first person are Heidi Meyer and Amber Long. Also joining us is a man who's tried to bring together alleged victims of abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses. He's William Bowen, once an elder within the congregation who resigned his position 2 years ago in protest against the way the group deals with suspected abusers. Now, Heidi, you were 10 years old when you were first abused. What happened? Heidi, who's Heidi Meyer, that's what it said. When I say Meyer, that's who we're talking about. So Meyer says, the man who abused me, he was a Jehovah's Witness in my congregation. His name is Derek Lindella. He was a friend of the family. He was friends with my brother, and I was friends with his younger sisters. And when the opportunity arose, or whenever he created an opportunity, he would pull me aside and molest me any chance he got. Chung asks, how long did this go on, Heidi? Meyer says, until into my 13th year, just after I turned 13. Chung says, all right, and you reported this to the elders in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and what happened? Meyer says, when I was 15, I went to the elders with this, as were instructed as Jehovah's Witnesses to do, and I spoke to them in hopes of discontinuing this problem, and that they would step in and take care of this person. Chung asked, did they? Meyer says, no, they did not. They not only said that they thought I had misinterpreted his actions, but they also told me that I needed to be careful who I spoke to about this and what I said about this, because without 2 eyewitnesses to the situation, I could be faced with a judicial committee for gossip or slander. Chung asks, basically, do you think they were trying to tell you not to go to the police? Meyer says, absolutely. They said to go to the police and bring this matter to court would be a reproach on God's name and God's organization. Do you see what I mean? That's why they won't talk. They're trying to save face. Because for them to have to do all this would have to admit that God was wrong somehow, or that their organization would suffer consequences to have a negative view of the Jehovah's Witnesses, which there already is a very big negative view of the Jehovah's Witnesses, because a lot of this stuff has come out. Okay. Chung continues to say, so you kept quiet. Meyer said, absolutely, under threat of excommunication, end quote. So I want to stop the quote here and talk about that for a moment. Do you guys see the patterns now? I mean, we've already seen a few cases. I've already given you some examples. And the cases are exactly the same. They operate the exact same way. I've already shown you from the US, from Australia, from Europe, all over the world. The stories are identical, which is very strong evidence that this is not some, okay, well, these are just isolated cases. No, it's commonplace. This is a very common problem for the Watchtower. But also that it's being covered up the same way all over the world. And the Watchtower is doing nothing about it. So, in the interview, Chung continues to say, quote, Amber, you claim that you were molested by the same man when you were 12 years old. What happened to you? Now again, this is Amber Long, so when I say Long, that's what I'm talking about. Long says, correct. I was at his parents' home. I was friends with his younger sister, and I was molested there. After that visit, I went home and told my parents immediately, and we also went to the elders, as is directed in that religion. Chung asks, and what happened? Long says, they, insinuated that it was a misunderstanding, that maybe I was upset, told us to come back and talk about it later. When I still stuck to my story, they told us there was really nothing they could do because there wasn't 2 eyewitnesses. And again, there was that veiled threat of being excommunicated. And all my life growing up after that, they, made insinuations to the fact that perhaps it was something that I had done that warranted the abuse. And you'll find that is a common thing in a lot of these religions when there's sexual abuse going on, that they try to somehow, again, this is what you call noble cause corruption. They try to make it seem like to the victim that the abuser is actually the victim, that they actually instigated this by their actions somehow. And that's ridiculous, okay? Certainly, if a full-grown woman is, or a young lady who's developing is walking around in stuff that's not appropriate to be wearing, they can, that's something that needs to be rebuked and needs to be set right. But it's also up to the male to make sure that he stays in control of himself and make sure to do what's right by God. Now, if he's not doing that, okay, it's not necessarily her fault. There are women who do. I mean, it's okay. There's like an example I want to give. It's kind of, this one can get, I guess, kind of debatable. But there was a news bro. I remember I was working security at this thing, and they had CNN on this television because we had to have a television in there for like emergency stuff. This was like it was one of the, I don't know, one of these big time buildings with lawyers and stuff in it we were running security over, so they had one of these things in there. If there was an emergency, we had to let the building know, blah blah blah. So they had CNN on in there, and I don't really care for any of that, but it's on. And they were discussing an issue in which there was a teenage woman, I don't know, she looked to be somewhere between like, I don't even know if she was teenage, somewhere between 17, 18, 19, something like that, right? And she was dressed in this extremely short skirt, okay, very, very short. And there was a guy with his smartphone, walked behind her, put his smartphone under her skirt, snapped a picture, and walked on. And she kind of noticed after he went by and saw what he did, and then she wanted to bring up charges against him, and they were discussing this on there. How he's not allowed to do that. On what basis is he not allowed? I mean, basically, you can take pictures of pretty much anything you want. But the problem, really, in the end, everybody else in the office was saying, well, that guy is wicked. And I said, well, not wicked, but they were like, what a jerk, what a sleazeball, all that stuff. That's what they were saying. I was like, guys, you're not wrong about him, but the fault is with her. And they were like, excuse me? How dare you say there's... You see, the feminist philosophy comes in. I said, no, the fault was her own. She did not have to wear a miniskirt showing off all her bits to everybody else, because that's exactly what she's doing. The reason she's wearing that stuff is because she wants other people to see it, and then when other people actually see it, then she acts like she's offended? That was her own fault. So in certain situations, I don't want to say that women have zero responsibility. They absolutely do. There would not be in the Bible a commandment for women to dress modestly unless there was a responsibility on women. But men share a responsibility as well. And I've had to write people an email when they say, oh, well, women, like there's some people that put it all on women and some people that put it all on men. And I said, no, I've told them both. I said, no, the responsibility is with both. It's not just one person, okay? The fact that the women don't want to dress modestly is a problem with their heart, and the fact that the men want to stare into them is a problem with their heart. So both of them need to fix their hearts. However, this is not the case here, and that's what I wanted to point out. In this particular instance, in the context here, what they're doing is they're putting the pressure on the young ladies that it was their fault, or in this instance, the little girls, because some of them are 10 and 12 years old. They're not immodestly dressing or anything like that. This is a pervert who is doing these things, and then they're feeling like they did something wrong. And it's the Jehovah's Witnesses that helps them feel that way. Chung continues to say, all right, Amber, we'll get back to you in a minute. Bill, you've gone so far as saying that you believe that the Jehovah's Witnesses is a pedophile paradise. That's a good description. She says, are you exaggerating? I know you've investigated, but I think one would believe that you might be exaggerating here. Now, don't misunderstand what Connie Chung's saying. She's not saying he's exaggerating. She's giving him an opportunity to really expound on his statement that it's a pedophile paradise. Bowen then says, I've spoken to over 5,000 victims of abuse either through email or direct phone contact. I have an abuse hotline that rings into my home, and I get calls every day. All these people are abuse survivors that tell the same story as Amber and Heidi do. That is, that they went to the elders and they were suppressed. They were covered up. It's a common thread. Yesterday I got a thread or an email from a young girl, 15 years of age. She went to the elders. She said, I am just like Heidi. And after seeing the recent media, I am angry that they would do this to me. And that's what most of these young ladies are. They're angry that they were abused and re-victimized by the policies of this church. Yeah, they would be, because first of all, the adults are supposed to be protecting them. Their parents are supposed to be protecting them, right? And the parents are submitting to Jehovah's Witness elders. And the Jehovah's Witness elders are not protecting them either. So then what they do is they turn it inward and blame themselves. And then when they get older, they said, wait a second, I didn't do anything wrong. And why aren't my parents and why aren't the Jehovah's Witness elders, why aren't all these people protecting me like they should be? Which, by the way, is a biblical matter. That's a biblical thing to do, to protect them. So, because after all, I mean, you have to stop and consider, under an atheistic or evolutionary philosophy, why do you need to protect women? I thought it was the strongest survive. Well, that's true. Then the strongest women should survive, right? That's the mentality. That's the philosophy that they teach. Only under biblical precedent, only under biblical context are the weak supposed to be protected. That they're supposed to be delivered out of the hand of the wicked, the poor and the needy. We'll cover those verses in a minute. Chung then asks, were you intimidated by the Jehovah's Witnesses? Meyer says, absolutely. There is no option but to be intimidated. Your entire life revolves around your involvement in that organization. That is your entire life, and it's often referred to as such in the organization. If you are ousted from that organization, it is a trauma in your life. There is an enormous upheaval. It is something that affects every single day of your life. Chung says, this is a statement from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'd like all of you to listen to it. Quote unquote, we abhor the sexual abuse of children and will not protect any perpetrator from the consequences of this gross and perverse sin. We expect the elders to investigate every allegation of child abuse. Unrepentant wrongdoers are expelled from the congregation. Special care is taken to ensure the victims are given ongoing assistance and counsel that help them deal with the pain of the abuse. They should never be told by elders not to report their allegations to the authorities, end quote unquote. Chung says, Amber, I can see you're shaking your head. Long says, that's just horrifying that they would write something like that. It's so untrue. Meyer then speaks up and says, and it's a good practice on paper, but it's just not applied. In my situation, in Amber's situation, in countless numbers of situations across the nation, and into other countries, it's just not applied. Chung says, but why would they put out a statement like this, which you claim is not correct? Now, of course, Connie Chung's not an idiot, but what she's doing is conducting an interview, allowing the witnesses to talk rather than herself. Okay, it's kind of like a lawyer would do it, but that's what they're doing that in order to let the facts speak for themselves. Okay. Bowen says that statement is a bold-faced lie, in my opinion. Oh, and folks, I'm not even gonna. I know he on television he has to say in his opinion. I'm not bound by those rules. I'm not going to say that's an opinion. That is a bold-faced lie. Period. He continues and says, these people know the abuse has been covered up. 10 years ago, research was done in the organization that they knew multiple little girls were being molested. They refused to acknowledge it then, and the fact that it's went on this long, if they make any acceptance that there's a problem, then they admit they willfully have hurt children and have not done anything about it. Chung asks, Heidi and Amber, what has happened to the member who you claim molested you? Meyer says absolutely nothing to this day. Long says nothing. Chung asks, is he a member in good standing? Meyer says he is a member in good standing. Long says, yes, he is. End quote. We see these young women were not taken seriously by the Jehovah's Witness elders because in many cases it is an elder who's the perpetrator. Or at the very least it's someone who's considered to be a dedicated Jehovah's Witness leader in the community. I mean, because that's what a pedophile would want to do. He wants to become an upstanding member of the community so that way he has an outward appearance of goodness so no one suspects him. Any mention of their wrongdoing, especially in the eyes of the public, makes them look bad. For at least I'm talking in context of Jehovah's Witnesses in general. If you find, one of their Jehovah's Witness elders, well, then the public says, oh, shame on you. It's this bad thing. Oh, these Jehovah's Witnesses, they got pedophiles over there. And that's the view in the public, right? Rather than, but anybody would know that if you publicly came out and says, we found this pedophile that was among us and we got rid of him because we don't put up with that stuff. Why not get ahead of it and say, we're going to put this sin down? The reason they don't get ahead of it is because they are harboring these men. There's another agenda, folks. It's not about doing what's right. They care more about how they look in the eyes of the people rather than judging righteous judgment. As John 7:24 says, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And so that means if people are not judging according to the appearance, how Jehovah's Witnesses want to appear on the outside, oh, they seem well-dressed and friendly and blah, 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 but they judge righteous judgment, then they're going to see past the facade. And please don't think, you're like, well, Chris, that's 2002, that was 15 years ago. No. You see, a corrupt tree brings forth corrupt fruit, folks. It doesn't just, poof, magically become good over time. And don't think that these types of instances are long ago and far away. I was just doing updates to this article yesterday, because I'm giving this teaching at the end of October in 2018, right now, this part, and I was just doing updates yesterday to this article because I was in preparation for the teaching we're doing today, and I decided to do a basic search and immediately found tons of results. There was just one that happened just a few weeks ago. A Montana woman came forward as a victim of child sex abuse in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and after the trial in September of 2018, the jury found the Watchtower guilty. She was awarded $35 million on the basis that the elders knew about her sexual abuse and instructed clergy not to say anything to anyone about it. From this article, from the Republic, which is entitled Jury, Jehovah's Witnesses Must Pay $35 Million to Abuse Survivor, it says, quote, and this is, they'll say at the end that they're quoting the attorney here, it says, hopefully that message is loud enough that this will cause the organization to change its priorities in a way that they will begin prioritizing the safety of children so that other children aren't abused in the future, attorney Neil Smith said Thursday, end quote. Well, that's sick too. Not the attorney, but what's sick, okay, look, the Watchtower, the Word of God is not important to them. That we know, okay? They can claim it all they want. They can give lip service to Christ, as he says, but their hearts are far from me. The Word of God is not as important to the Watchtower as money is important to them. So this lawyer hopes that the courts are now speaking a language Jehovah's Witnesses understand, which is money, which is the language the Watchtower has always spoken because money was the concern from day one, way back when Charles Russell was involved with Nelson Barber back in the 1870s. It ought to be an outright shame that they won't do things on their own to protect the children, but have to be pressured by financial threats before they will purge out the pedophiles. And even having to pay out massive amounts of money in lawsuits, they are still protecting these perverts. So let me go on to another report. The next one we're going to cover is about Candace Conti. Now this one is fairly well known. Some of you might even recognize the name if you've ever studied the connections between the Watchtower and child sexual abuse. Now, when Bowen made the comment during the interview that, because there was a section, if you remember me reading that, he said the same thing happened, quote, 10 years ago, end quote. What I think what he's partially at least referring to, if not all mainly referring to, is the event from 1993 with Candace Conti. Now, Conti was a young girl, and she went door to door evangelizing when she was a child. Okay? And she was overseen, because she wanted to do what was right by Jehovah's Witnesses for Jehovah, and you have to go door to door doing this stuff, right? She was overseen by Jehovah's Witness leader Jonathan Kendrick, who ended up taking her back to his house after they were done door to door evangelizing and molesting her on several occasions. Many years later, as an adult, Conti found Kendrick on a government website listed as a known sex offender. So he finally had been reported to the police. At that point, when she saw that, she felt guilty For all the other, she thought, how many other girls have been molested by this guy because I didn't do anything. I didn't speak up. I didn't do anything to stop him because of shame, because of guilt, or not shame and guilt, but embarrassment and fear. Because of all that, she didn't stand up and tell the truth to stop this guy. And so many other girls have been hurt. She felt guilty about that. She said, you know what, I'm hiring a lawyer. And she contacted the authorities and went to guns. Good for her. I'm glad she stood up and did that. The truth is always the best thing. Michael Clark, an elder of the North Fremont Kingdom Hall where Conti had previously attended, this is where everything was surrounding, okay? That's where all the incidents were surrounding where this happened. He was called in, Michael Clark was called in to a deposition in which he testified to the following. This is from, I got this documentation off of PBS NewsHour. It says, quote, "Do you recall becoming aware of a report of sexual abuse of a child by Jonathan Kendrick?" They're asking Clark these questions. Clark responds, yes. He did remember. He's saying yes to, he did remember that report of sexual abuse by Jonathan Kendrick. The interviewer asks, when did you become aware of such a report? Clark said he had called us to his home to discuss and then he pauses, he says, or confess to an incident with his stepdaughter, end quote. In earlier parts of this teaching, I mentioned a PBS reporter by the name of Trey Bundy, and that he documented the letter that Clark sent to the Watchtower concerning this matter, okay? Which, in the letter, I'm going to read it to you just now, but notice that it proves not only that the abuse was reported, but that Kendrick actually confessed to it. It says, quote, "Dear brothers, we are writing to you regarding a case of child abuse. We telephoned 11/12/93, so that's November 12th, 1993, and it was suggested that we submit in writing our questions. We met on November 11th, 1993, with Jonathan Kendrick, a ministerial servant who confessed to child abuse with his 15-year-old stepdaughter. The abuse occurred approximately 4 months ago. He confessed to touching the breast of his stepdaughter while she was sleeping. She was awakened instantly and knew what had happened. His wife was informed that evening, and the three of them talked it out between them," end quote. I'm thinking about that conversation of the family sitting down and talking about that at the kitchen table. What a shameful conversation that would be. I can't even imagine. Especially for her. The letter goes on to state that they removed Kendrick from his leadership position after the elders were informed. And, of course, now some of you might be saying, well, Chris, that actually departs from the typical thing we've seen from Jehovah's Witnesses in the Watchtower. If they got wind of this and they kicked him out, I mean, they removed him from his leadership position. Isn't that, opposite to what we've seen so far? Oh, yeah. But, you see, the letter, the response they received back from the Watchtower told them that it was not necessary to remove him from leadership. So now here we are back to square one. Rather, they told him that they should simply, quote, "provide him with strong scriptural counseling to avoid a repetition of such a serious offense," end quote. Now, if a man, again, was repentant, he had grief and sorrow, and godly sorrow of his wrongdoing, of his sin, I could understand this on a first offense. But the problem is that they allowed him to take up leadership positions. I mean, he wasn't taken away from leadership. He was allowed to continue in it, in which he would freely work with teens and children unsupervised. So they ignored Candace Conti when she came forward to testify of Kendrick's molestation. They never once contacted the police about what was going on and discouraged members from talking to the authorities. So they already had on record the guy was sexually abusing, he admitted to it, his stepdaughter, and then when Candace Conti, it happened to her, they ignored the whole thing. During the trials, it was discovered that Kendrick had left the Kingdom Hall where Conti had previously attended and took a letter of introduction to another Kingdom Hall, which was called Oakley Congregation. The letter of introduction had no information about his past child sex abuse, and so he was allowed to operate freely once again in a new location eventually marrying into another Jehovah's Witness family at this new location, and then sexually assaulted later his 6-year-old stepdaughter. His 6-year-old stepdaughter. Trey Bundy, I'm sorry, I'm trying to present this in an informative manner, but I can't, you're going to hear anger slip out. That's just going to happen, okay? Trey Bundy interviewed Roger Bentley, a former 30-year veteran elder of the Oakley Kingdom Hall, and together they looked over Kendrick's letter of introduction written by the elders of the Kingdom Hall where Conti was molested. It says, quote, Bentley, there's no indication at all that he's guilty of child abuse. What he means is he's not making that as a statement. Bentley is saying, look at this letter of introduction. They don't say anything about it, even though he confessed to it. Bundy then responds, so no mention of child abuse, but any mention of children. Bentley responds, well, if you read it, it very specifically says, quote unquote, he's a very interesting individual who has taken the lead with some young ones in the congregation and helped them from veering off course, end quote unquote. What? He's a very interesting individual who has taken the lead with some young ones in the congregation and helped them from veering off course? Bentley continues by saying, that's not a child abuser. That's a recommendation. That's a very specific recommendation. Oh, relax, he's good with kids, end quote. So don't misunderstand, when I'm quoting them saying that, he's not saying that in the manner of like he's making statements about that. He's saying, here's what they're trying to say in the letter. Oh, he's good with kids, you guys will love him. Kendrick confessed his abuse during the deposition and served 8 months in jail. The Watchtower, in effort to protect themselves, tried to argue the First Amendment freedom of religion in court. Okay, stop right here. That is stupid. Flat out. And I'm going to explain why. And I think I want Christians to understand this. Folks, I told you, for those of you who've listened for a long time, you know that a long time ago I used to be involved in like the liberty campaign movements and stuff like that, okay? I started to get involved in some of the political stuff. Even, my wife and I went to, this is before she was my wife. Lori and I were just friends at the time, but we went to like these grassroots campaign classes, okay, in which we were talking about people having me run for in the Constitution Party for a seat on the city council in Columbus and stuff like. I used to be involved in some of that stuff, but as soon as I started to get involved with it, I got out of it because something wasn't right. And folks, the liberty campaign movements, there are so many wicked people in there that try to act like they are so good, and they are as wicked as they could be. Okay, and there's a bunch of people, and they butt heads on philosophy so much. They try to act like they're unified. They are not unified. Not in the least. So don't let them fool you. Okay? But I've been over this stuff, and I've heard a lot of people, and I've met a lot of people who are like, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, blah, blah, blah. Here's what you need to understand. Okay, first of all, the Liberty Campaign people, it's almost like they think that the First Amendment applies no matter what. That is not the case. The amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which I would say, let me rephrase that, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, not all of them, but the first 10 were designed to protect the rights of the people, which is prefaced by stating that it's the rights of like life, liberty, and property, okay? Well, they say the pursuit of happiness, but it's really about property. It's about protecting life, liberty, and property, because property is essential for freedom. If you can't have private property, you can't have freedom, okay? So the amendments were designed to protect those rights to life, liberty, and property. The problem, the thing a lot of people are not told, especially not even in basic schools in America, in public schools they're never taught this stuff, is that the First Amendment of freedom of speech, freedom of religion is thrown out. It is gone the second you commit a crime. The criminals of the United States are at least not supposed to, I won't say don't, but are not supposed to have any rights but two, as far as I know. They have the right to remain silent, and they have the right to an attorney, which, by the way, the right to an attorney, court appointed. That really only came about, I think, in the 1960s. Okay, due to a lot of the changes in the law processes and all that stuff, and really it's complexing the matter farther than it should have been. Our system of law and lawyers and the legal process has become way overcomplicated, far more than it ever should have been, because again, more wickedness on top of wickedness. It would take too long to explain right now, and that's not the topic of what we're going over today. But the point I want to express is that people need to understand that the First Amendment is gone the second a crime is committed, or the intention to commit a crime. If there's the intention, meaning that they're expressing intention to commit a crime. So if they're, like, for example, if somebody writes someone else, okay, somebody writes something out and they make a death threat. Now, they haven't done the crime, they haven't murdered anyone. They said, I'm going to come to your house and kill you. If they said something like that, there's a problem. That's not freedom of speech. That is not, threatening someone to kill them is not protected under the First Amendment. There are consequences to that. So that's what I mean with criminal activity, or the intent to commit criminal activity. The amendments of the Constitution, you get thrown out. You don't have your freedom of speech. You don't have your freedom of religion. You don't have your right not to have your persons and papers seized. You do not have the right not to be held as a witness against yourself. It's only, people say, what do you mean? They put criminals on trial. Yeah, that's when they're on trial. They haven't been actually convicted of a crime yet. They have a right not to be a witness against themselves, okay? But when they're arrested, they only have two rights under this. Now, they do have specific, don't misunderstand, I may have stated that wrong. They do have certain basic rights until they've actually committed the crime. But what I mean by that is, like, the example of, okay, let's see, say a police officer. Let me give this example and I'll clear this up, okay? I don't want people to get confused. A police officer is sitting across the street on a break, eating a snack, and he sees at a convenience store some guy walk in with a gun, hold it to the face of a cashier, demand all the money. They get out the money, give it to him, he gets the bag, and he runs out the store. Well, the cop gets out of the car, he chases after the burglar, and he grabs him, pins him down, and cuffs him and arrests him, okay? At this point, the criminal has no rights. None. He does not have rights by any minute, because he's already been caught. He was seen by multiple eyewitnesses. They probably have camera evidence on top of that. The guy is as good as done. There is no argument. There's no trial. He's convicted. It's proven. There's no reason to even have... he has a right to a defense. Sure. But all the evidence is stacked against him. They caught him in the act. So that's a blatant, over-the-top example that would almost never happen. Everybody's got a right to a fair trial in the United States, right? And that's what I'm saying, is that's what I mean by the rights, and certain rights that they do or don't have. But that's once they're convicted, once they're proven to have committed the crime, they don't have rights anymore. And that's where people need to get off of this thing where, if the police officer had chased that bad guy, that robber, and pinned him down, and as soon as he pinned him down on the ground, like, he may have forced him on the ground, the guy hit his head or something, he's like, abuse, I have rights. No, you don't. No, you don't. That is stupid. That is them in their ignorance thinking they have rights when they're committing a crime. So what happens when the Watchtower is protecting pedophiles? That means that they're basically aiding and abetting rape. That's what they're doing. When you're aiding and abetting a rapist, you don't get freedom of religion. It doesn't work that way. Okay? And that's why I think it is so absolutely foolish, just downright absurd and ridiculous. Then there's debates going on today of whether, well, if we arrest a Muslim, we need to provide them prayer mats and things like... No! If you have someone who's been convicted, like a Muslim, who's been convicted of a crime, okay, they have found him guilty, and he's in prison, you don't have to provide them religious anything. Now, the state can be lenient. For example, if God forbid any of you Christians would have to go to jail, but if you did, okay, especially if it was over something that you did wrong, I hope, listen, Christians sometimes end up in jail they didn't do anything wrong. That happens sometimes. Other times they did do something wrong, okay, and they need to pay the price for it. Now, the state can be lenient and give them a Bible, but they have no obligation to give them a Bible. They have no obligation to give them any of that stuff. So, anyway, it's foolish to argue such a thing in court because the U.S. Constitution, again, does not protect proven criminals under the First Amendment. I don't care which religion they claim to be a part of. Thankfully, the court shot down their fallacious argument and awarded Candace Conti $15 million in compensation to be paid by the Watchtower. And based on the last report that I saw back in 2017, Kendrick is still an active member in good standing with the Oakley congregation. Candace Conti was abused sexually as a child. They went through the court trial. They had to pay out $15 million, and Kendrick is still. Candace Conti's not. They won't speak to her, but they will associate with Kendrick, the rapist, and he's still an active member in good standing. I mean, these are just a few of the thousands of cases that are being brought to light in recent years, and more are coming forward all the time. You're going to see more and more pop up in the news. However, the Watchtower still insists that they've done nothing wrong. As Stephen Lett, one of the top leaders in Jehovah's Witness organizations, said in a video response to all the surfacing accusations of child sexual abuse in the Watchtower. Now, we're going to listen to this, okay? Before I play this video, I want to mention a couple things, because if you're listening to this by an audio recording, you may not be able to see, obviously, unless you're going to the website and you're watching the video for yourself. And by the way, these types of videos, folks, I don't put all the videos that we have on YouTube. If you think you're going to go YouTube and like flip through all the videos and see everything that we have, you're wrong. YouTube is not the foundation of our ministry, folks. I go to the website. That's where I have everything. I have a lot of unlisted videos that are meant specifically for those articles. And so there's a lot you're going to miss unless you go to the website and check out the articles, read this stuff, and get those things there. You're going to miss, just like I said, we do a first and second half teaching. The second half goes on YouTube, and I do that for just to organize different things. I don't put the entire teaching on there. If you don't go to the website and get stuff, you're going to miss a whole lot of stuff. Most of our materials are there. But before we're going to go over this video, I want to describe to you the face of this man. Because when I first watched this guy talk, this guy, his mouth moves so strangely. Like, I've never seen this before. He's very unique in that. Now, I'm not saying it's not just some, physical quirk that he has that he's always had. Perhaps that is the case. But he does a few things in there that are indicative of a liar. If you've ever heard the word, a tell, what a tell is, poker players use that, is when they have certain tells. They'll see, when somebody has a good hand, they'll act in a certain way, or they'll react in a certain way. And if they're bluffing, they'll act in another way. So based on whether they're trying, you see, if they have a good hand, they want to lie and try and deceive, and if they're bluffing, they want to lie and try and deceive. And so when people are lying, they have ways that they have certain things that they will do. There's facial tics, facial quirks and expressions that they will use, the way that they'll say things, the way that they look. Like oftentimes if you have someone that you see, and this is one of the things you could see it on interviews sometimes. If you have somebody who's lying, like go and watch a video of someone who has been proven to have lied in the video, you can see them, they will, if they're asked a question, and their response, they're trying to think up a lie. If they are right-handed, typically their eyes will move toward the right. And if they're actually remembering something, if they're right-handed, if they're remembering something that actually happened, they will look towards the left. Sometimes I've seen it, and I've watched these, where people, what they'll do is they'll try to mix some truth with the lie. And so you'll see them, when they go to answer the question, they'll look to the right, and then they'll look to the left. They'll look to the right for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, and then they'll look to the left for about 1 second and then answer. What they're trying to do is mix up their lie and put some truth in it. It's very interesting. I've watched that happen, and it does work in quite a number of cases. You can see people do that. They won't catch themselves when they're doing it. And part of the reason they do this, folks, why is it that people have all these quirks and all these tics, and why do these different things happen? I would say that is more evidence of God. And a lot of people would say, Chris, you're insane. Okay, that's fine. You can call me insane, but I'll show you the logic. People are doing that because they have a conscience. Their conscience bears witness. They know they're lying. They know they're deceiving people. And it's like their body physically cannot allow them to lie because their conscience bears witness. What is their conscience? Their conscience is bearing witness of the law of God that is written on their heart, and that is more evidence of him. The fact that they cannot even lie straight. Now, you might meet a psychopath somewhere along the line who has learned how to keep from doing any of those quirks, but the problem is the fact that you could catch them in a lie and them not have a quirk response to that shows that they are psychopaths in the first place. I mean, there's investigators that use these techniques to determine those types of things. But getting back to Stephen Lett, he does this. He's one of the leading elders of Jehovah's Witnesses, and he does this. You'll see him when he's talking, he'll frequently lick his lips. That's one of the things that liars will often do, okay? You'll see them sometimes, like even they'll do certain things with their lips, like they'll bite their lips or lick their lips or do something like that, and they'll do it frequently when they're lying or they're really nervous and or agitated because they know they're going to have to lie or something like that. Well, they don't have to lie, but they choose to. And another thing you can look out for that this guy does is quick smirks. What that means is that the side of his mouth, you know, he puts his lips together and it's almost like if you know when you smile and the sides of your lips come outward, right? It's like you do that on one side only, and you do it just real quick, like it's a quick smirk. What that is, it's an outward expression. It's almost like their true heart is coming out for just a split second in just like one of the muscles in their face. And then they're trying to actively hide everything else. This guy does that. He has a lot of tells in which you can observe that he's lying while he's saying these things. So let's take a listen to what he says here, because this is an informational video that was sent out to all the kingdom halls, and just listen to this.
Another way we can contribute to the oneness, rejecting false stories that are designed to separate us from Jehovah's organization. As an example, think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization. We reject outright such lies.
Okay, well, you know, that's what he's going to claim there. He says, oh, well, we're rejecting false stories that are designed to separate us from Jehovah's organization. He's like, these are apostate-driven lies. And that's exactly what the Australian Royal Commission was asking Jeffrey Jackson about at the very beginning of this section on, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses and child sex abuse. When I was quoting Jeffrey Jackson, they were saying, look, would you agree that our intentions are not just apostate-driven lies, that there is evidence of what we're claiming and we're trying to work together with you to catch the criminals? And he says, yeah, that's true, I accept that, but not according to this. Then what they do is they will tell that to the public, but then go back to Jehovah's Witnesses and say, no, these are just apostate-driven lies. Do you see the two-faced, double-hearted, I mean, unbelievable, the tongue of vipers. And you can see, if those of you who are watching, because I for some of you who are watching live, I'm screen sharing with some of you for our church. But then, you know, if those of you who go back and watch the video, you could see some of that, couldn't you? If you watch him closely, you can see him start to lick it, because he says, that's just ridiculous, isn't it? And he does that quick licking his lips again. You can tell he's lying. This is all for show. This is all like a script that they've given, and they chose him because probably he was the best actor out of all of them. But now that we've heard him say all these things to the Jehovah's Witnesses, saying, oh, guys, these are apostate-driven lies, let's go back to a hearing, because I put this in the video as well. At the end of this, I put in a quotation in a hearing. This is a deposition that was done with a man by the name of Richard Ashe, another one of the Watchtower members of the governing body over the Jehovah's Witnesses. He's in charge of child sexual abuse cases. They put him in charge of the whole thing. Okay? Let's listen to what he says.
But within the congregation, ours is a spiritual protection. When we're talking about physical protection, that's up to the secular authorities to provide.
It states in paragraph 3, there is a time to keep quiet when your words should prove to be few. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
You know, Mr. Joe, object to that. It's a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of association.
Okay, if you didn't quite hear what he said, that's the end of the video. But the second they said, you see right here where you said there's a time to keep quiet, a time not to say anything. He says, you see where it says that? And then Richard acknowledged it. Richard Ashe said, yeah, I see that. And then his lawyer says, objection, that's a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of religion. No, it's not. They stated that in the context of protecting child abusers. That's not freedom of religion. And the court shot that down. That's what I mentioned earlier. The court said, no, that is not going to fly. You can't do that, and you can't say, oh, well, we have freedom of religion, so we can protect perverts and let children continue to be abused. The government's not going to put up with that. Now, I also want you to take note of what he said here. In his statement, he says, okay, well, let me go back to Stephen Lett first, because I want you to notice something very interesting that is said here, okay? Stephen Lett, and I will repeat what he said here, he said, quote, if anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization, end quote. To protect our young ones. Now, the guy who's in charge of child sex abuse in the governing body of the Watchtower just said the following, quote, within the congregation, ours is a spiritual protection. When we're talking about physical protection, that's up to the secular authorities to provide, end quote. You snakes. Unbelievable. That means, what that actually means is that Lett is telling all the people, oh, we protect our young ones. But you see, the actual definition of what he means is later given by Richard Ashe, meaning that we're saying it's only a spiritual protection. But then no, it's up to the secular authorities to give them physical protection, but we won't work with the secular authorities and we won't contact them about anything. So basically what they're saying is that we refuse to protect children from rape. That is exactly what they are saying here. I don't care how somebody wants to try to say, oh, well, that's not true, or you may have misinterpreted it. I am not misinterpreting anything. This is exactly what they're saying. That is how they are defining the terms, because as soon as they go to Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll try to be vague with them and say one thing, but then when the government forces them to define exactly what they're talking about, you can see all the deception come out. The Jehovah's Witnesses do not contact the authorities for that physical protection, which means the Watchtower does nothing to protect these children. They do nothing to counsel them. They do nothing to help them. The only thing they do is they tell them to shut up and don't talk to anybody. I think we need to read Psalm 85 one more time, starting in verse 2. How long will ye judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Selah. Selah means stop and think. Consider the matter. Defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them out of the hand of the wicked. But the Watchtower Society won't do that. There's no spiritual protection from them either. Don't let them give you that. Because they are not Christians. Because they are not of Christ, and they reject the Christian God of the Bible, they cannot offer any spiritual protection. Because they will not contact the authorities, which would be the government, which God put in place for the protection of the people and the punishment of evildoers. That's what the Bible says in Romans 13. They are supposed to be a terror unto evil and to help those who are good to judge righteous judgment in that. They can't offer spiritual protection from them. They have no protection. And so for any of you that might have even been considering, well, maybe I should join the Jehovah's Witnesses. If you want to protect your children, I'd stay as far away from them as possible. So that's where we're going to end on the teaching this week, and next week we're going to pick up what I was talking about. I didn't know how far we were going to get, but next week what we're going to do is follow a line, and we're going to be talking about the Adventists, okay? Because Jehovah's Witnesses are actually only a branch of Adventism. A lot of people don't seem to understand that. We're going to follow this line of Adventism through Jehovah's Witnesses, and we're going to see why, and I think next week is going to be a very good lesson as to why we are supposed to sanctify ourselves from wickedness, why we are supposed to sanctify ourselves from false doctrine, which is what the Bible calls leaven. There's a very good reason for that, and I think we'll see some good examples of that next week. Anybody have any questions or comments about anything we talked about today before we close? Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, this week, and may the Lord Jesus Christ bless and protect you all as you seek to study His Word and glorify Him in all that you say and do. And God willing, we will see you next week.